This video will be part 1 of my coverage of Karen Horney and humanistic psychoanalysis for PSY 230 personality theory. Like many of the theorists that we've looked at already, Karen Horney was born in Europe. She was born in Germany in the late 1800s. In her early experiences, which many historians in psychology believe were really formative for her theoretical work later, her parents had a lot of conflict over what Karen would do with her life. Karen, from an early age, was interested in science and wanted to pursue an advanced education, particularly as she got older. Given the gender norms of the day, her father was opposed to this idea. Her mother supported her desire for education. Suffice it to say, she received a lot of the blowback caused by her parents' conflict over what she wanted to do with her life. As you can see, her mother and her mother's support for her and her own dogged determination won the day over her father's opposition. She became the first German woman to get into medical school, and she completed her medical education despite the fact that she was the only woman typically in her class. She, like Freud, like Jung, like many other of the European psychoanalysts of that day, she was a medical doctor first, but since psychoanalysis was becoming quite popular, she studied under Carl Abraham, who was one of Freud's inner circle students. So Karen Horney is often considered to be a second-generation psychoanalyst because she studied under one of Freud's early students. She also read Adler a great deal, who we studied last week. and you can see, as we lay out her theory, that there are some similarities in their ideas. So she clearly was influenced in some ways by his work. She went on to found, with several other people, the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute, and she taught there for several years until conflict within the organization led to her departure. During the 30s, this was during the period of World War II, she came to the United States. She taught at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute for a period of time, but after she published what was considered by the Psychoanalytic Institute a controversial piece of work, she was driven out. You have to think about the psychoanalytic community within Europe as well as the early institutes for psychoanalysis in the United States during this period. They were very insular and in some ways kind of intellectually incestuous. So anytime one person who was vying for power published ideas that were deviating from the traditional party line, there was conflict. And, the whole thing was very dramatic. So she parted ways with the New York Psychoanalytic Association, founded her own American Institute for Psychoanalysis, and stayed there until she passed away. During her time in the New York psychoanalytic community, she had there's not a good way to describe it. She had an affair with Erich Fromm, who their ideas are intertwined. Some argue that he stole ideas from her. Others argue the reverse. From the timing, it appears that he was very strongly influenced by her work. But they were close, but they had a deeply contentious affair with one another that for from Karen Horney's point of view, really was devastating for her emotionally. One of her legacies is that she was a founding editor of the American Journal of Psychoanalysis, which was very influential at the time. What Karen Horney is probably most known for is what we could call it feminine psychology. She used that terminology in her writing periodically, but she produced this collection of essays that outlined some of the criticisms that she had of the traditional Freudian model of the development of women. She obviously disagreed with the Freudian model of female development and had some very pointed conceptual differences with it. So she argued that, in her experience of, studying with a student of Freud's, in her reading of Freudian psychology, in her reading of Adler and others, that traditional psychoanalysis was defining the psychology of women only from a male point of view, and it was her opinion that this point of view was flawed. She argued that Freud, in particular, but by extension other psychoanalysts, tended to view women as defective, and certainly from a clinical standpoint, Freud was pretty clear that he saw women as incomplete males and tended to define their psychology as in terms of their deficiency. She argued, and this is why she's often considered to be one of the precursors to feminist psychology, she argued that women need to be understood from their own life perspective, and she argued that women, in fact, are different from men, but they're not inferior to men. So she was an advocate of the point of view that you shouldn't see men and women as equivalent, but instead they are distinct, but should be equally valued. And her criticism of psychoanalysis in the traditional form was in that perception that women were inferior and deficient, both biologically and psychologically. She elaborated on this and when if you read Horney in the original, if you find a good translation from the original German, you can get a sense of a little of her sense of humor, and a little bit of her tendency to use witty sarcasm. So you kind of have to take a little bit of what she's arguing here in terms of describing this concept of womb envy as kind of lobbing a grenade in the face of the psychoanalyst. At the same time, though, she's trying to make the point that the female experience, that the experience of women, being given that they give birth to children, that they have this pride in their role as mothers, that there is something to be envied there, that males find that those feminine roles to be mysterious, they find them to be threatening, and that leads them to it either unconsciously or overtly to devalue women. So she described this entire kind of constellation of unconsciously devaluing women in the construct of womb envy, which was a direct challenge to Freud's argument that girls, in order to resolve their Oedipal issues, did so by somehow converting their envy of boys and men, which is an expression of penis envy, by just giving up and becoming women. Horney elevates the value of the feminine and argues that, in fact, much of male psychopathology is driven by their envy of the power of women reproductively. She also argued that the the tendency for men to overvalue their work, and in particular, she talked about and wrote about creative work. She suggested, and again, you would have to read some of her work in a good translation, or if you speak German, to read the original. There are these little sneaky jokes that she tells, but she talked about the intensity with which men identify with their careers and with their creative work. She saw it as an overcompensation for the fact that they can't carry and nurture children in the way that women can. So they have to birth something, so they pour their energies into creativity. She argued that womb envy eventually becomes a stronger force than penis envy, which then, translates into the sexism that men inflict on women. So the tendency to deprecate women, to devalue women, to treat them badly, then, it becomes sort of her way of explaining some of the treatment that she received herself as a female in medical school, surrounded by men who didn't want her there, and they were very clear about the fact they didn't want her there, and they were very threatened by the fact that she was often far brighter than they were, and she was being successful despite all of their efforts to make her uncomfortable and to chase her out. So she tries to put within the context of psychoanalytic theory an explanation for why men are like this. And, her suggestion was that this powerful thing that women and the female body are capable of doing, and that is completely alien to men, is converted into this unconscious desire to devalue and deprecate women. She also talked about the idea that men are actually fearful of women because they represent everything that they cannot have. They also fear the criticism that could come from women if they fail to perform sexually. So she felt this an additional thread here that helps to explain the hostility with which men sometimes treat women was in the form of the potential for females to sit in this critical judgment of their sexual performance. And then finally, she concluded from all of this that the males of this cultural context, they overcompensate for their inability to do the things that women do so naturally, which is, this whole constellation of relationally based things, emanating from the fact that women can give birth to children, but also the broader emotional lives of men, or of women rather, and their interactions with children, since men are kept outside of that and can't really, in this early 1900s kind of context, they really have no role in that set of experiences. They compensate by completely housing their identity in their work, in the form of conquests, conquering women, and simultaneously debasing the women that they claim to love. And in some ways that comes in the form of control, so domination and control. She described this whole business in the form of what she called the masculinity complex. She acknowledged that women can and do, and she wrote herself that she found herself as a young woman, especially during her education, as being angry about the fact that men could move so easily in the world, that they could move so easily in their roles, in not just medical school, but in the wider world. They could move in the world without fear. So she acknowledges that women often envy men. But it's not that they want to be men. And while she acknowledged that the feminine gender role was in many ways severely limiting, and it was limiting in ways that she herself found uncomfortable. She was not always comfortable being a mother, and found the role to be very difficult and one that she was often ill-suited to. She often found herself alienated by the role of wife. So she acknowledged that women can be unhappy with the fact that they don't have the access to the world that men have, that they can't move as freely in the world as men can, and that the feminine gender role can be severely limiting to them. That doesn't mean that they want to be men, however. So she describes this complex as, in this quote, the entire complex of feelings and fantasies that have for their content the woman's feeling of being discriminated against. So she's making a very gender discrimination argument here, and that was very early. She was putting out into the world of psychology this complex argument that says, no, it isn't their biology, it's their socialization. That's the problem. So this complex that says, we have these feelings or we have this social context that pressures women to see themselves as less. So they hear all these messages from the people who have power around them, from their fathers, from their male siblings, from their male classmates, from their male teachers, from whoever, that males are privileged and that females are not. And that can become internalized. So women, she felt, when they felt limited, often would turn that limitation in on themselves, and then it would emanate in the form of psychopathologies such as depression and anxiety. She saw all of this as being as coming from a cultural context in which males were preferred over females. So, as your authors describe it, it's a product of male-dominated culture and certain kinds of families. Now, as I said earlier in the little bio of Karen Horney, her parents fought over her and what she wanted to do. And her father's argument was, you should marry, you're expected to marry, and your route to success is by marrying the right person and then having children with that right person. Your value, your worth is in terms of the children that you have and the kind of marriage that you have. She wanted to work in the world, in her father's eyes, as if she were a man. Now, you can imagine, as she starts studying psychoanalysis, she's faced with these men, people like Freud and his immediate students, who had basically the same argument to make, and now they boiled it down to her biology. Well, she was able to compete head-to-head with male students. She was just as bright as they were. She graduated, despite the hostility that surrounded her. She just thought Freud was simply wrong, and she wasn't willing to allow that to stop her, so she wrote about it. She also wrote about this concept called the overvaluation of love, which she felt was very problematic for women. They're taught from an early age that they have women, that is, they have a desperate need to love and be loved. And, in the quote that I placed here, it corresponds to a vital need. Love is overvalued in our culture. It becomes a phantom like success, carrying with it the illusion that it is the solution for all problems. So essentially, men are told, for men, what's overvalued is work and creativity. So it's what they do in the world. For women, their socialization overvalues their capacity to be loved and to be in a love relationship, and that becomes the signal of their value. Now, this idea that it's the illusion that it is a solution for all problems, she kept being told, whether it was by her father or by her friends or by other people around her, just the basic cultural messages, that the path to success as a woman was through the love relationship. And if she didn't successfully have that relationship, that she was a failure. So that's what she's referring to as the overvaluation of love. So in your author's description, Horney asked this question. So why do women, so many women who come to psychoanalysis, appear to be desperately sad because they don't have a man attached to them, and that they haven't been able to either form a relationship or maintain a relationship, or they feel that the relationship they're in is not one that is satisfying. So maybe they don't feel that the men that they're with are loving to them, and they feel it's their fault. And she wanted to know why this was, and theoretically, how she dealt with this was she looked at it in a psychoanalytic framework. Obviously, that was her training. So she wanted to go back to childhood and say, where's the frustration coming from, and why are women seeking the solution in the form of relationships with men that then end up being disappointing? She traces it back to the loss of the mother, and then competing in a futile way for her father's attention. So she's losing the battle for the father's affections. Now, if we go back to the Freudian version of Oedipal issues in that period of development, he argued that girls seek power by trying to possess their fathers. For Horney, she puts it in a different context, but one that is equally problematic in terms of effective functioning. She says that girls aren't trying to possess their fathers, to control their fathers. They're trying to compete with their mothers for their father's attention and affection. And they see their mother as a rival. So if you go back to Freud argued that boys do that. They compete with their father for their mother's affection. Horney is basically flipping that over and saying that girls, they see their mother as a rival, and they start very young trying to compete with other women, first with their mother, for their father's affections. And they lose to her because, socially it's inappropriate, but also because, they're children and mom is, already with dad. So they lose that battle. The response then becomes withdrawal. So she believed that in the developmental period that girls go through this experience of fighting for affection from father and losing to mother, and then withdrawing from men, at least briefly, but then in adolescence, they start to compete vigorously with one another for male attention. Now, if I think back to my days as a girl growing up and being in grade school, middle school, especially middle school, that's when, the fierceness of the competition really kicked in, where girls started to compete with other girls in order to get boys to pay attention to them. Horney, was really kind of pointing to that in her own social circles. She felt that it was ridiculous when girls spent all of this mental energy trying to get boys to be attracted to them. But then in her own life, she struggled with the exact same thing. She found herself continually being drawn into interactions with men where she felt herself really needing male validation. She married, she had a child, but she wasn't happy It was a marriage that was not fulfilling for her, and the role was stifling as well. So she had her own experiences of trying to make sense of why her own patterns of behavior were problematic. Eventually, she used this description of vindictive triumph, where girls compete with other girls, and in a twisted kind of way, as they get older and move into adulthood, they're trying to throw it back in mom's face in some ways. They do that behavior, this almost mean girl pattern of behavior, in order to cope with their own self-hatred. And we'll talk more about that as we go forward. Now, beyond her essays on feminine psychology and her criticism of the Freudian model of womanhood, one of the bigger contributions of Karen Horney is really shifting the emphasis in psychoanalysis to bring in cultural factors. The Freudian model is very biologically based, where Freud thought all of the differences between males and females, they originate in the body. So he's starting with the assumption that cultural factors really don't matter, that human beings are human beings, it doesn't matter where they land. Horney thought that was ridiculous. So she brought in this set of ideas that really deviated from the Freudian belief that biology was destiny. And she wanted to see psychoanalysis be more inclusive of what would be called now social psychological factors that shape gender identity. She felt that for boys and for girls, that the roles in which to which they were forced to adjust were limiting, that they forced an adaptation to the world that was basically neurotic and problematic. So both women and men, she believed, were really enslaved by these restrictive, rigid notions of gender identity. She saw penis envy as a meaningless concept, and in some of her writing she was trying, by being provocative, to demonstrate that. What women really want, she argued, was a recognition that males are given privilege that they don't deserve, and that females are denied that privilege in a way that is unfair to them. The cultural message that she tries to send is that their power is assigned within cultural systems. So you have this definition of the female ideal in patriarchal cultures that is a vision of female functioning that is, by its nature, according to Horney, neurotic. So if you live up to the female ideal in a patriarchal culture, you will be by necessity a psychological mess. That was her argument, that the problems that brought women to therapy, that brought them to psychoanalysis, were largely caused by the fact that they were being raised and they had to live in a patriarchal environment. She felt that the primary goal, if you want to have healthy human beings, you had to, you don't have to, dig around and find what is the biologically feminine and then enhance that, but instead to allow people to fully develop all of their human potentials. Now you can see the thread back to her upbringing. She wanted science. She wanted to be a scientist. She wanted to be a doctor. She wanted to be a psychoanalyst. All of these things were in the male zone. And she was constantly told that it is not yours to have, but she got it anyway. But she got criticized for doing so, and so on and so on. So her theory, as her theoretical ideas matured, really went in this direction of allow human beings to develop into all that they can be and stop forcing them into these lanes that are defined primarily by gender roles. So the new paradigm she starts with this assumption that, Freud was wrong in assuming that there's a universality of certain kinds of emotions, of certain kinds of beliefs and attitudes, and certain kinds of relationships. He assumed that things that were simply common to his culture were in fact the norm the world over. Horney was well-read and well-traveled enough that she rejected that idea. She felt that a large amount of what we see in patterns in people's behaviors were determined by their cultural surroundings, which means they are changeable, and they are determined by that context. She didn't believe that the conflict between person and culture is something that has to occur. In other words, there are good environments and there are bad environments. There are some environments that are health promoting and there are environments that are neurosis promoting. Some environments, when they are flawed, interfere with our ability to get our needs met, and as a result, they tend to produce negative emotional responses like fear and anger. Freud's description of people as inherently dark, basically, as your authors put it, insatiable, destructive, and antisocial. Some put that Freud tended to believe people were basically evil. For Horney, she felt that those characteristics, being hard to satisfy, destroying things, being antisocial, she felt that those were all attributes that were not inherent. They were, in fact, results of bad environments. So if you have a bad environment, there's a normal neurotic response to those bad circumstances. So if we become insatiable, we become destructive, we become antisocial, it's because the environment has shaped us to go there. So in a sense, she's in identifying this new paradigm, she's rejecting the Freudian premise that biology is destiny, that you are determined, not just in the sense of sex differences, but generally speaking, he felt human beings were predestined to fight continually against their animal nature, which was, by its nature, insatiable, destructive, and antisocial. Horney thought that was wrong. She felt that those capacities were brought out in people by bad environments. So, by extension, if you change the environment, good things come out of people. So that's a precursor in many, many ways to what Carl Rogers would argue, to what Abraham Maslow would argue. And in fact, when we get into the chapter on Carl Rogers, you're going to see a lot of Karen Horney's language show up in Rogers' theory. One of the most important concepts in Karen Horney's work is this concept called basic anxiety. This is one of those places where her reading of Alfred Adler really kind of comes through. She believed, like Adler, that early on we kind of experience the world when we're little. We experience the world as a big, scary place because we're small and we can't always compete. So, excuse me, basic anxiety is something that most people experience. So whenever a child experiences the environment as something to be feared, then the emotional response in the child is going to be basic anxiety. She believed that basic anxiety could arise out of what she referred to as pathogenic conditions in the family. So any kind of situation within the family system that makes kids feel like they're not safe, like they're not loved or valued, can prompt basic anxiety. Essentially, what she's arguing is that children, humans, whether they're little or not, they need to feel safe, they need to feel loved, they need to feel valued. Now that idea will sound familiar if you remember back to your introduction to psychology course, where you studied Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What are the basic psychological requirements that human beings have? They need to feel safe, so they have to have their basic biological needs met. But that middle tier, that's all about feeling loved and feeling valued. So again, Horney is really showing us that some of her ideas were influential in the humanistic movement that came far later. Basic anxiety comes out of this sense of helplessness. And that idea is similar to what Alfred Adler argued, that kids come into the world small and helpless, so their immediate sense is, I've got to find a way to be more powerful. Horney doesn't have quite the same take on it. She argues that this feeling of helplessness in a world that's hostile, or that often feels hostile, when the conditions within the family are such that the child feels unsafe, that engenders a sense of anxiety, which then translates into helplessness. Now, where neurosis comes from in these pathogenic conditions within the family, the child has to find a way psychologically to adjust. So under bad family conditions, the basic anxiety, basically the child, as the child grows, has to find a pathway that controls that anxiety to some extent so that they can move through the world at least somehow without succumbing completely to the anxiety. So what they do is adopt a strategy of defense in her description of it. So they either choose the pursuit of love, which she argues is the pathway that women are socialized to pursue, or they choose the pathway of power, which was one of the options that men are often pushed toward, or they choose the pathway of detachment. Both males and females can be socialized in those directions, but males somewhat more often. The defensive strategies, she argues, are fundamentally neurotic, because not just because they're defensive. Defense is a normal part of the reaction to the world, but because they ultimately don't satisfy basic human needs that people have. There's a need for balance. We need love, but we also need to be powerful, and we also sometimes need time to ourselves. So you get some sense here of what she sees as ideal. Ideal is a balance of love, power, and detachment. If we pursue one and dismiss the others, we're living in an unbalanced way. So we have to, if we adopt one of these pathways and dismiss the others or suppress the others, we're living in an unbalanced way. Now we need to make a distinction here between how she's describing structure and how she's describing origins. You can focus on the description of personality structure. So she provides in her model a way of describing individual differences in adult personality, and she describes that separate from her descriptions of how children develop early on. So you can describe adult structures of personality separate from how they got that way, which is basically a replacement for how Freud focused on this psychosexual stages of development with a strong emphasis on the first 5 to 10 years of life, but a lot of the heavy lifting goes on in those first few years. She spends some time talking about that early childhood period, but only in the sense that if you have a structure that magnifies basic anxiety, it's going to push the child to make a selection of a problematic neurosis-producing cluster of behaviors. So she's less interested in describing the origins, the genesis of these issues, and more concerned with the specifics of the defenses that people possess, because those are the things that need to be readjusted in therapy. So she's not really interested in going into the past. She wants people to get an understanding of the pattern of neurotic functioning and the pattern of defenses that they have, and then move them in the direction of a more balanced expression. The past, she argues, is always going to be showing up. So if we focus on the present, you're going to get at the issues from the past, but there's no need to dwell there. The developmental process is what it is. It's going to continue repeating itself within the patterns of adult behavior. So there's really not much to gain by looking at specifically early childhood experiences or early childhood patterns. This idea of, how do people really develop? Horney argues you need to pay attention as the analyst to each step that people take, because it will inform you as to which neurotic solution they are invested in. And that concludes part 1 of my coverage of Karen Horney.